Hello, everyone, and good morning from California, and good morning to the East Coast of the United States as well. Good afternoon to those who follow us in different parts of Europe, and also good afternoon to those who follow us in different parts of Brazil. It is Portuguese Immigrant Week in California. And so, on behalf of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, that's PBBI, from California State University, Fresno, we want to welcome each and every one of you to this event and talk to you a little bit about Portuguese Immigrant Week in California. We are very, very happy to feature this presentation about Portuguese Immigrant Week in California. It is a product, as I said, of PBBI at Fresno State. And we will be, of course, here with you every single day between now and next Saturday, live here with you as we talk about the Portuguese experience in California. And so welcome each and every one of you on behalf of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, that is PBBI from California State University, Fresno. We are happy to have you on board. We have 2 sessions per day, and some weekdays also we will have little tidbits and pieces that'll be put forth through our Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute Facebook page and also archived on our YouTube channel. And so if you have not subscribed to either one of them, please do. We will have little bits of information throughout the day in the next week commemorating Portuguese Immigrant Week in California. So as I share the screen with you to talk to you a little bit about Portuguese Immigrant Week in California, when did it begin? It began in the 1960s. Then Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, was the first to declare the first full week of March as Portuguese Immigrant Week in California. And how did this happen? Well, it happened thanks to the lobbying of the Portuguese American community already in the 1960s. Sometimes we think that what is happening today in the Portuguese community is actually what has not happened before. But our role in the California mainstream in one way or another has been an active one for over 100 years, way over 100 years, for at least 125 years. And even more, but certainly the last 125 years, because the first few years, of course, that folks immigrate from another country, you're busy trying to establish yourself and trying to adapt to the new land. However, since, of course, within the last 125 plus years, the Portuguese Americans have been involved in various facets of California life. And in the 1960s, a man who contributed immensely to the Portuguese American experience in California by the name of Carlos Almeida, an immigrant from the island of São Miguel. Mr. Almeida was with the UPEC, one of the largest Portuguese fraternal organizations in the state, that is União Portuguesa do Estado de California. And Mr. Almeida took it upon himself with other community leaders, obviously, to begin this process and to have a Portuguese Immigrant Week established by the governor of the state. So it's been established since the 1960s. It's been with us for over 50 years. And unfortunately, we don't do a whole lot with it. And that kind of is a lacking in our position, that we need to do more things with American mainstream. Obviously, we do our festas, and they're great. And obviously, we do all of our cultural and traditions, including, of course, our religious traditions, and those are great as well. But more and more, as the community now has a new phase, we indeed have to look at how we can use this Portuguese Immigrant Week as a way to have our presence, our culture, our traditions, our history, the history of Portugal and of the Azores and Madeira Islands, but also the history of the Portuguese Americans in California, and have that commemorated at American mainstream venues. That is so important. We can still obviously continue, as we should, with our festas, with our traditions, with our with our various festivities and events. And these, of course, can be tailored just to us if that's what we wish. More and more, they should be multicultural events and not just for those who are of Portuguese immigration or Portuguese ancestry. And that's happening in some communities more than others, but it is happening all throughout the state of California. And that's a good thing. And I congratulate all of those in the different committees who work tirelessly for the festas and our events, and who are now looking at other ways of promoting the festa and the event beyond the traditional Portuguese American community, because our community has also changed. 100 years ago, we were in probably a couple of dozen cities in California. And today, according to the U.S. Census, even though some cities there may only be 20 Portuguese, but we are in over 500 cities. And so we have changed immensely as a community in our landscape. And so there are, of course, those traditional Portuguese American communities in certain parts of the state. But besides those traditional Portuguese communities, whether they be in the Valley, in the LA Basin, or in San Diego, or in the Bay Area, and of course, way north in Arcata, in that part of California as well. But now Portuguese Americans, because of there's no longer a language barrier, many who identify as being of Portuguese background, it was either their parents, grandparents, and in many, many cases, great-grandparents that immigrated. So they're obviously California citizens of the United States of America, not just by naturalization, but by birth. And their parents already were, in some cases, their grandparents as well. And their great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents were the ones that immigrated. So folks, of course, lived the California life independently of being in a town or city that has a bit of a Portuguese tradition or not. And how do we reach all of these? That's a debate that needs to continue. We've had them before through PBBI and with the help of various organizations, including the Luso-American Education Foundation and their conference. But these weeks, like Portuguese Immigrant Week in California, should really be a time for us to really, for lack of a better word, penetrate American, in this case, Californian mainstream, whether it be through the news, whether it be through op-eds in local newspapers, whether it be through programs at different schools, not just those who teach the Portuguese language and culture, because there are only a dozen high schools in California that teach Portuguese language and culture. And so, and there are 4,400 high schools in California. So we need to basically quadruple that just about in order to have about 1%, I should say, 1% of the high schools teaching Portuguese in California. So 4,400 high schools, only 12 high schools teach Portuguese in California. I know you may listen to different numbers, but as far as numbers of high schools, which is the schools where the majority of Californian school children, in this case teenagers, of course, learn a language, learn a foreign language or a world language, another language other than English. And that the vast majority of the students that learn another language learn it at high school. There are immersion programs like the one in Hilmar in Portuguese and many in Spanish throughout the state and other languages as well. There are bilingual programs, but the majority of the students who learn another language other than English do it at a California public high school. And so all California public high schools teach basically Spanish, and there's lots of them teaching French, and a few of them are also teaching German and Japanese, and of course, Mandarin Chinese and other languages as well. And of course, of those 4,400, there are only 12 that teach Portuguese, and we need to do a better job with that as a community, because it is up to us as a community to change that. But at high schools, at elementary schools, whether they teach Portuguese or not, we should have a Portuguese unit for Portuguese Immigrant Week. And this week has had some debate in the past. Some of you might know about it, some of you might not. But in the past, there's been some one might call it a bit of controversy. Is it really, should we continue with Portuguese Immigrant Week? Because For over 40 years now, we have not had many immigrants, although there's been some in the last few years. And every year there's a few families that come, even just 2 or 3 families from Portugal. But of course, it's not the 2 or 3 families per week that were coming at one time, and even more than that during the exodus of the 1960s and beginning of the 1970s. However, but the mass immigration from the Azores, from Madeira Islands, and from mainland Portugal, very few from mainland Portugal, has of course ceased. And it ceased basically around 1980, as we know. So it's been 43 years. And so now, since we do not have this immigration, does it make sense to have a Portuguese Immigrant Week? From my perspective, it does. And it does because we are honoring the immigrant spirit. Whether if you yourself are of Portuguese background or another ethnicity, and you weren't an immigrant, but maybe your parents were, or your grandparents, or your great-grandparents, or your great-great-grandparents. And so let's honor that spirit. We are all here because on the shoulders of someone. As has been said many times, and President Barack Obama used it quite often. We are all here on the shoulders of someone. And to celebrate Portuguese Immigrant Week in California is to celebrate those who came before us and built what we are and who we are and what we have today. On another aspect, another time that is of utmost importance is, of course, during the month of June, when we have Portuguese Heritage Week, or I should say, let me rectify that, Portuguese Heritage Month in California. Portuguese Heritage Month, it's declared by the state legislature, both the Assembly and the Senate. And so that is another time to have, of course, the Portuguese commemorated outside of the traditional Portuguese hall, outside of the traditional Portuguese venues that thankfully we have many and many throughout the state of California. So this week, the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at California State University, Fresno will be commemorating. We will have 2 sessions per day, one at 8 o'clock in the morning and one at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Some of them will be, most of them in the afternoon will be live, and they will be either a panel or a conversation about some aspect of the Portuguese American experience. Most of them will be in English, although we will have 2 of them in Portuguese. And because it is important to still speak the language, that is my first language, but that is for some of you, it was also your first language, even though some of you may not speak it any longer, but some of you had been around it since you were a child. And if it wasn't your language, of course, it was the language of your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, or great-great-grandparents. And so we must honor the language as well. We cannot just have the culture, which is the way we have to, of course, look at, but we must continue to honor the language as well. And so we'll have a couple of events in Portuguese. The 8 o'clock event that we'll be having every day will either be a kind of a lecture like this one is, or it will be also a oral history interview from the literally now hundreds that we have done in the last 4 years, or approaching 100, I should say, at PBBI at Fresno State. And so Portuguese Immigrant Week in California, a little bit about our experience, and to talk to you a little bit about the Portuguese and who we are and how we got here. I know that some of you know that. Some of you, this might be new to you in one way or another. We hope that it is a good refresher if you know it, of course. And if you don't, hopefully it'll be worth your while to listen to it. So the Portuguese, of course, have been here in California for a very, very long time. According to Dr. Eduardo Meian Dias and his work, he has been basically the one that has been part of the Portuguese, has been studying the Portuguese experience for a very, very long time. And so the idea that we have, of course, the first Portuguese that came to California, according to, and we can go back, of course, to Cabrillo, and there's all that debate around that. But as far as someone that came here, that is registered, that we know, that came here to live and stay here in California, it was before California was a state. And It was an immigrant from the Minho province, and it was in 1812. So it's been a while. It's been over 200 years. Where did the Portuguese that now live in California, whether they're immigrants, first, second, third, fourth, and even fifth generation, where did they come from? Well, as you can see, there's 4 different maps there. They came, of course, from Portugal, but Portugal has islands in the middle of the Atlantic, and those are Madeira and Porto Santo and as Ilhas Desertas, the deserted islands, and a little bit, and Madeira is close to the coast of Africa, and then right in kind of almost in the middle of the Atlantic, not quite, but a bit more distant from mainland Portugal is, of course, the Azores, or Açores, as we say it in Portuguese. There are 9 islands, as you can see there, and there are immigrants in California from all 9 islands. The majority, if we look at some of the DNA and of course some of the studies that have been done, the majority are from what we call the central islands of the archipelago. And what are the central islands of the archipelago? Terceira, São Jorge, Pico, Faial, and Graciosa. But we do have strong communities from São Miguel in both the Valley, Southern and Northern California. We have communities from Santa Maria throughout different parts, and especially in the California coast. We have communities from Flores, very strong one in the Fresno area. And we have communities from Corvo, a few folks from Corvo in Northern California and in the Valley, in the Turlock area as well. And so all of the islands are represented here in the state of California. According to the U.S. Census, as all of you know, it's around 350,000 people, and that's a different debate that we can have, but it's 350,000 people according to the U.S. Census, and according to the same census, according to the same studies, about 90% are from the archipelago of the Azores. It's actually over 90, but let's be conservative and say around 90%, which leaves the remainder 10% to be from Madeira and mainland Portugal, probably 6 or so percent from Madeira and the rest from mainland Portugal. And from mainland Portugal, there are people here from all over. There are people, of course, from northern Portugal, there are people from central Portugal, and there are people from southern Portugal as well. And that is basically, of course, how our roots are in these islands and in mainland Portugal as well. A couple of pictures of the different parts of Portugal, whether it be mainland Portugal there in the middle, or off to one side, my right side, is the beautiful island of Madeira, and off to the left side is a picture of the Azores, and that is the Ilhéu do Monchique in the which is an islet called Monchique next to Flores Island, and it is technically where Europe ends and America begins. So it's the westernmost point of the European continent. Of course, you know, if we talk about the continent as it is together, it would be in mainland Portugal. But since the islands do belong to Portugal, they're an autonomous region of Portugal. We'll explain what that is in one of our sessions. But so since they are part of Portugal, the island of Flores and the islet of Monchique is the westernmost point of Europe. It's where Europe ends and America begins. So coming to California, of course, we have Cabrillo in 1542. There's still a lot of different debate out there. Is he Portuguese, not Portuguese? There was an academic that just came out with a paper about that he is. And so that is a debate that's probably going to be in the academic world for a very long time. But Franciscan monks came in 1587. In Sein João Azevedo, as you can see the spelling there, Texara, comes from Teixeira, came in 1602. Sebastião Rodrigues Cermenho in 1595. António José de Azevedo in 1799. António José de Rocha, I misspoke when I said 1812, 1814. António José de Rocha in 1814. Joseph Miller, José de Souza Neves in 1836. These are some of the documented people, according to all the studies that were done and all the research by Dr. Eduardo Meillon Dias. Manuel Dutra de Vargas in 1837, José Redella in 1842. And so those are some of the early ones that are registered. I'm sure there were others, we all know, but these are the ones that we have documentation for. Early immigrants, of course, came for various reasons, and many of them, as far as the islands of the Azores and Madeira as well, came because of whale hunting expeditions and whale hunting off of the coast of California. But of course, soon they went into other areas, and they, of course, became part of the California landscape. So we have a couple of these things that I'd like to talk to you about. Of course, the gold rush, and we actually are very excited because one of our presentations will be with Lara Goulart, poet, laureate for El Dorado County, Portuguese American poet, and who will be talking about a book that her family published about the Portuguese. And it will talk, basically, it will give us a lot of information about an area that sometimes we forget, and that is the importance of the Portuguese around the gold rush. And that doesn't mean that they were necessarily in the rivers or the mountains looking for gold, and many of them weren't, but they had businesses and they worked in businesses that supported, of course, what was going on at that time in California with the gold rush. The first wave of immigrants, of course, came to the Bay Area, mostly Northern California, but soon people, started coming inland into other areas, to the Sacramento area, to the San Joaquin Valley, of course, to Los Angeles and to San Diego, and those had come early on as well. Because of the ports, and because obviously those areas had tremendous growth indeed. And so as we as I'd like to mention to you that then in so the immigration continued, I should say, in bigger numbers, especially in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, all the way up until 1921. The Immigration Act of 1921 really curtailed the number of immigrants from Portugal to the United States. In some months, only 900 people were allowed to come. And so that Immigration Act of 1921 really had many reasons, and historians look at it from various angles. There was the political powers at the time in the United States felt there was a need to control immigration from the so-called countries of Europe that had the dark Europeans. And the dark Europeans were, of course, the Portuguese, the Italian, the Greeks, the Spanish, and the Turks. And so there was a need to control that. And so immigration basically continued from other parts of Europe, but some of the countries like Portugal were severely penalized with the Immigration Act of 1921. And so there was sparse immigration from 1921 to 1958, 59. And that immigration was basically, a lot of times, people who had been born here and who had gone back. And, excuse me, people who were born here and had gone back, or if they had gone back as children, then they would come back as adults. And so between 1921 and 1959, for example, in my own family, I have two aunts who immigrated at that particular time. And because they were American citizens, because my grandfather, like many, obviously the majority stayed here, but a good percentage of folks that had immigrated from the Azores, and some from Madeira and some from mainland Portugal, but certainly from the islands of the Azores, went back. And some of them went back because of the Great Depression. Some of them went back because they had made some money right before the Great Depression, sold what they had and went back. And so, and for various reasons, those are just two of the many reasons. And so most of them had children. And these children, of course, were American citizens, such as my own family. My grandfather, my grandparents, my grandmother, and my grandfather had 8 daughters, 5 of them born in the United States of America. So they went back, and when they went back, of course, to Portugal, they were American citizens. They kept their documentation in order. And when they became adults and they were married and things weren't very well economically in the Azores in the 1950s, and early 1960s and throughout until actually the autonomous region took effect in 1976. Then, of course, they came to America because they could, and they were American citizens. They could bring, of course, their families with them, their husbands or wives and their children. And that's what happened. So it was sparse immigration, but there were immigrants who came to this country and who came to California between 1921, those who had applied, because there were still a few that could come. Of course, this was curtailed also by the Great Depression, as I mentioned, and also by World War II. Then, of course, the Azorian Refugee Act, which you see the pictures there, and which is unique when we talk about refugees from all parts of the world. Yes, the Azorians also had their Refugee Act, the Azorian Refugee Act, which had two different parts to it. I know everybody knows about it. It's because of the volcano in Capelinhos in the island of Fayal. And it was very generous because it allowed a lot more Azorians that were affected by the volcano to come to the United States under this Azorian Refugee Act in 1958. And then the Immigration and Naturalization Act, or known as the Family Reunification Act as well, that was signed by President Johnson in 1965. That allowed the biggest exit of immigration that we had. And that allowed it because by 1965, of course, we had those who had come at the turn of the century, and who were elderly and who could, but could bring their brothers or sisters. They may now at this time be, 60, 70 years old. But if they had brothers and sisters in Portugal, they could bring them on over, or even 70 or 80. And then also the ones who had come part of the Azorian Refugee Act, and those like my aunts who had come at that, as what I call that sparse immigration period between the mid 1920s and late 1950s. They also, through the Family Reunification Act, could do the documentation to bring their brothers and sisters, their moms and dads. And so it opened up a whole new world for the Portuguese, the Azorians especially, and the Madeirans in particular as well. And that was it's also known as the Family Reunification Act of 19. And so a little bit, there was a problem with the sound. I apologize. A little bit about some of the issues when it comes to, of course, or some of the reasons why people came and what they did. So whaling. In the Central Valley here, different parts of the Central Valley, sheep herding was, for example, in Fresno, Tulare, Kings, Madera, Merced counties. Some of the first Portuguese that came to these counties were sheep herders. In Southern California, especially in San Diego, the tuna industry. Small businesses, whether they be commercial business in Northern California or Southern California, or ag businesses in the Central Valley, was a way that many Portuguese made a living. Construction in all parts of the state, but certainly the immigration that came in 1950s and 60s and even early 70s, and throughout the 70s as well, was very heavily involved in construction in different parts of the state, especially Northern California, especially the Artesia and Norwalk and that area in Cerritos, and also in San Diego as well. And then agriculture and dairy industry for the Central Valley, not just the Central Valley. Artesia in Southern California was an area that had, as all of you know, many dairies that still existed in the 1950s and 60s, and Chino, the Chino Valley area, that whole area of Chino, Norco, had a tremendous amount of dairies until about a dozen years ago, or about a little bit more than that in some cases, but anywhere between 15 to 20 years ago. It was a very, very, in the 1960s and 70s, many that came from the islands of the Azores found work in the dairies in the Chino area. And of course, all throughout the Central Valley, and in the early days, also in Northern California. There were dairies, of course, in the East Bay that in the early days when folks immigrated in the 1890s and throughout the beginning and even to the middle part of the 20th century as well. And so those are some of the industries. And again, apologize for the sound issue, but we are back. And so that was some of the, those which you saw, there was some of the industries that the Portuguese were involved with. So we will be having these small lectures. This one was a bit bigger because we, of course, wanted to kind of give you a bit of information about the Portuguese Immigrant Week in California. But here is basically a excellent set of books that every Portuguese American home should have. This is what I've used for my talk. The bibliography is these books. There were these books basically, and as you can see, there's a lot of different books there, but not that many. But there are there's of course Dr. Mayan Diaz's book, The Portuguese Presence in California. I highly recommend this book because The Portuguese Presence in California is a small book, less than 200 pages. And in that, you can get a lot of information about the Portuguese American experience in California. Kudos to the Portuguese Heritage Publications of California that no longer exists, but that printed literally thousands of these books. We actually have them at PBBI, thanks to Tony Goulart, Jose Rodrigues, and Henrique Denis for offering us some of the books. And we're actually going to be using it in one of our courses, and hopefully in the future it'll be published again, because it is a wonderful book, because in just a very, very read that you can do, 5-6 minutes per day for about a few days, you can get kind of a synopsis of the Portuguese American presence in California. Then, of course, there are other books that go into more detail, and I'd like to point this one right down here, Capelinhos, As Sinergias de Vulcão, the synergies of a volcano, and it's also in English, and there's a Portuguese version. The picture here is the Portuguese version, but it's in English, and that really gives an overall view of the community post the volcano of the Capelinhos, so that last exit of immigration, not just from California, but from a total of the United States. There's collaboration from the East Coast and the West Coast on this book. Of course, the Portuguese shore whalers in California is an excellent documentation of the Portuguese experience from 1854 to 1904. The Portuguese Californians, Immigrants in Agriculture, which was a book done by Dr. Alvin Graves, and what a great resource that is. Of course, it's a great big book, and I think it's pretty much out of print, and we don't have it any longer, but hopefully it can be published in a different manner in the future, because it's a great tool for Californians of Portuguese background, and the book there about the Portuguese in San Diego as well. So these are just some of the resources. There are others. There's been plenty of books published, including books in fiction and books in poetry that we'll be talking about. I think one of the great books to read in fiction is Anthony Barcelos' Land of Milk and Money, because it talks heavily about the San Joaquin Valley, about the rural areas of the San Joaquin Valley. But it's applicable to many parts of the state, certainly to Chino and Artesia. Actually, some of the protagonists visit Artesia during a festa, and so it is a wonderful book that will in a fictionalized manner. Of course, it's a novel, will give you a very, very good perspective of the Portuguese American presence in California, especially around the 1950s and 60s, and around that time where the community was a bit different. In other words, the older community that had come in the 1880s, 1890s, and all the way up until 1920, that, of course, that community was aging, and some had already passed. And so there were, already Californians that were born here, second and even third generation, but the community was infused on a almost weekly basis with folks who were coming mainly from the Azores, but also from Madeira and also from mainland Portugal on a weekly basis throughout the 1960s and 70s. So it was a very, very different community than what we have, of course, today. And Anthony deals with all of that, Anthony Barcelos, in the book Land of Milk and Money. And there were, of course, many other books of poetry as well that I would highly recommend, and we'll talk about those here as we feature these daily conversations, let's put them that way, of the Portuguese American experience as we commemorate Portuguese Immigrant Week here throughout the state of California. At PBBI, we want to commemorate it with information, with conversations, with oral history, with it's all fine and dandy for us to have a dinner and of course, other events that commemorate it, but we must commemorate it with our stories, with our history, with our fiction, with our poetry, sharing it with each other, and through, of course, the magic of social media and other outlets, is sharing it with all of those here in California and throughout the United States and throughout the world that want to know about the rich experience of the Portuguese in California. Happy Portuguese Immigrant Week, everybody. We will be having different updates with different things throughout the day, as I mentioned to you, through the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, that's PBBI, Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute's Facebook page, so do look at that. We will be having different things about, we're having different posts. If you haven't liked the page, do that, because it'll give you information on a daily basis. And of course, our YouTube channel has an amalgam over 220 hours of different recordings from presentations, debates, poetry readings, etc. And so lots of different ways for us to reflect on the community, to learn a bit about the history of the community, and of course, to even plan. And as the title of the last Luso-American Education Foundation conference was, that was sponsored by BBBI at Fresno State, navigate the future. We must all do that, those of us in the Portuguese American community, and thanks to all of those who are not Portuguese American, but are following and learning about this rich experience that the Portuguese have had in this great state. So happy Portuguese Immigrant Week, everyone, and we'll see you next time. On behalf of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute from Fresno State, thank you so much for joining.